The movie begins with a loving family scene. Sandra is enthusiastically discussing her new book with a writer. Meanwhile, her child is busy giving the family dog a bath. The interview is going smoothly until Sandra's husband starts playing his instruments loudly. Despite trying to continue, Sandra realizes her husband is purposely disrupting the interview, so they decide to reschedule. Sandra smiles and sees the writer off. Later, the young boy takes his dog for a walk. When he returns, he is horrified to find his father's lifeless body lying in the snow, covered in blood. Sandra quickly calls the police. Upon investigation, it becomes clear that his injuries are unusual. The wounds suggest he was not hurt from a fall, but from a sharp object, and his body is covered in various bruises, deepening the mystery of what really happened. Sandra is sobbing in pain, but they have no hope left. Her husband has been dead for almost an hour, while Daniel was out with his dog. Daniel is in great shock, and Sandra is exhausted from answering the investigation team's questions. She has explained everything that happened that morning, but the investigators are still trying to figure out the actual cause of death, as the circumstances are puzzling. They even ask her to replay the situation and remember every detail. Daniel, although blind and knowing nothing, is also questioned. Sandra remains persistent with her answers, but the blood spatters on the wall don't explain anything clearly. Another investigator attempts to recreate the situation using real-life experiences to solve the mystery. They take Sandra to a customized studio, play the same music, and ask her to recall her husband's fall. They repeat the exact questions from the interview and recreate the whole scene, but reaching a conclusion is not easy. Meanwhile, Daniel stops eating and talking to everyone. Sandra, worried, invites his grandmother to talk to him, but nothing changes. The investigation officer begins to suspect Sandra, indirectly implying she might have killed her husband. However, he knows the wounds are different, and that no head injury occurred from banging against the attic or anything like that. Sandra took him to the office, where the investigator measured all possible causes of death and considered the family's concerns. He noticed a bruise on Sandra's arm, but she claimed it happened while working in the kitchen. The cops were uneasy about the nature of the husband's wounds, so the investigator took the case to court for further investigation. The attorneys believed Sandra and her husband had a strained relationship. Sandra explained that her husband had a habit of playing instruments loudly whenever he was annoyed. He wanted her to stop the interview because he didn't like the student asking questions, so he played music loudly, and Sandra understood and stopped the interview. She said she wears earplugs and goes to sleep when her husband works on the top floor with loud music. The court found this hard to believe, questioning why she would sleep through loud music instead of checking on her husband. Sandra stated that her husband never liked being interrupted while working and mentioned that he had tried to commit suicide 6 times before. While many thought it was a typical murder story, the actual facts were surprising. Daniel was also questioned, but his words didn't match earlier explanations, which he attributed to a trauma response. The facts remained unclear, so the investigation continued. A spatter analysis expert concluded that the 3 drops of blood resulted from a heavy bang on the husband's head on the top floor. The distance and shape of the blood drops suggested they fell from a significant height, indicating a deliberate push. The fall from such a height justified the head wound, and the blood drop density explained the impact. However, the investigation officer is still unsure about the actual facts because he doesn't fully trust his theories. No weapon was found, and since Daniel was out of the house and Sandra was sleeping, it complicates the case. Some spatter analysts believe that the husband fell from the top floor, hitting a small portion of the roof edge, which caused the wound. They suggest the blood spatters resulted from the immense pressure of hitting the floor, with 3 spatters marked on the wall. This theory seems plausible, but there are still gaps. Biologists question why no DNA was found on the roof if the head hit a small room. The analysts speculate that the snow melts every hour, possibly washing away any blood and DNA samples. Due to the blunt investigative methods, Daniel is advised to skip the sessions, as the questions and facts might disturb him for life. Despite his desire to listen, the attorney and his mother suggest he stay away from it. though he resists. The next hearing focuses on the husband's recent suicide attempts. Sandra explains that he was on several medications and had stopped taking them, leading to severe effects and an aspirin overdose. She found him unconscious in his separate bedroom. She clarifies that their relationship was normal, despite sleeping in separate rooms, and she often woke him up. The psychologist, however, reports that the husband had no signs of depression but was taking medications for emotional stability. He reveals that Sandra blamed her husband for their son's accident, which resulted in Daniel's blindness, and she held him responsible for everything, causing emotional turmoil. Sandra admits they had arguments after their son's accident, but believes they were typical relationship fights. Sandra befriends one of the investigation officers and tries to clear her side. She urges him to admit she is not guilty, but he maintains he is just following job protocols. He doesn't want to hurt her by revealing harsh facts. Sandra reassures Daniel of her innocence, not wanting him to think of her as a murderer. The next hearing focuses on a recent conversation between Sandra and her husband. They argue about Daniel's homeschooling. Sandra isn't involved in Daniel's household chores, leaving her husband to handle everything alone. He brings up the renovation, but Sandra keeps blaming and gaslighting him. He wants more of her time, but she's always busy, leading to a violent fight. They throw glasses at each other, and he punches the walls. Sandra lies to the attorney about the fight and the bruise, but recordings reveal their devastated married life, how Sandra abuses her husband, and how he acts out violently. Sandra prioritizes her writing career, needing time for it, but her husband compels her to participate in house chores. She isn't ready to give up on her writing and shouts at him, calling him a failure who doesn't try hard enough. She insists he is responsible for his own failures. Sandra explains that the bruise on her arm is due to her husband's hard grip. She hides this detail because she doesn't want to be a suspect. The investigators don't believe her, but her friend, an investigator, tries to support her claim that her husband was sick and violent. He was on medications and often threw tantrums. They present pictures of the dents he made on the walls and an X-ray of his fractured fingers as evidence. However, Sandra is the most likely suspect in the case. Daniel also knows about his mother's infidelity and their frequent arguments. She is asked about her cheating and how her husband reacted to it. Sandra claims they had an open relationship and he was okay with it, but recordings suggest otherwise. The ambiguity arises because the recordings could be fabricated. Sandra knew her husband had been recording her for a few months and was initially okay with it. But now she thinks she provoked the fight deliberately because the recording was on. The judge adjourns the case for the weekend and orders Daniel to testify. He is obliged to stay in the house without meeting or talking to anyone. Sandra is forced to remain silent throughout the weekend for Daniel's protection. The court hires a woman to stay with him, but Daniel decides to live alone and doesn't want his mother around. Sandra is shocked to see her son doubting her regarding his father's murder. She tries to prove her innocence and talk to him, but she isn't allowed to. Distraught, she leaves the house in tears and finds a hotel for the weekend. Sandra sobs, realizing even her son doesn't believe her. The woman staying with Daniel tries to talk to him about his perceptions, but he is adamant that his mother is not a murderer. However, Daniel is unaware of his mother's cheating and the violence. He is deeply disturbed and cries out loud while discussing his mother with the woman protecting him. She tries to console him, but he bursts into tears. In his distress, Daniel performs an experiment on the dog by giving it a large dose of aspirin. The next morning, he finds the dog unconscious and freaks out. The woman helps him treat the dog with salt water, and thankfully, it recovers and vomits the aspirin. Daniel notices the dog is behaving strangely more silent and lazy than before. He did the experiment to prove his father was suicidal, recalling an incident when the dog ate his father's vomit. Though he wasn't fully aware of the consequences, Daniel is relieved to have his dog back. He believes the overdose of aspirin was his father's way of escaping stress. His father used to be silent and lazy after taking aspirin, and the dog was acting the same way, even before it got sick. Daniel and his father once took the dog to the vet for similar symptoms. However, as they journey back home together, his father begins to share some deeply contemplative thoughts. He speaks of wanting to toughen Daniel up for the inevitable loss of their dog, mentioning how anything, even aspirin, can be lethal. Daniel slowly realizes that his father's words were not just about the dog, but a subtle hint towards his own struggles and inner turmoil. In a moment of clarity, Daniel comes to terms with the fact that his father took his own life, and that Sandra had no involvement in his tragic decision. By recounting their recent conversation with his father, Daniel effectively clears his mother of any lingering suspicions. This pivotal revelation leads to Sandra being exonerated, allowing them to return home with their honor and reputation restored. Despite the turbulent nature of their relationship, Sandra's actions were never driven by malice. While she may have been emotionally abusive and harsh towards her husband, she never resorted to physical violence except for one regrettable slap. Now that her son is aware of the truth, Sandra feels exposed, with her private conversations and struggles laid bare. The homecoming brings a sense of closure and relief. Here movie ends,